I want to introduce you to a family. And we have spouse one. And this spouse has children to a prior spouse. And we're going to call these children the green children. And so spouse one met spouse two, who also had some assets. They combined them, and spouse two had the mustard children. And they got together, and they had the grey children. Unfortunately, spouse one was then deceased. And my question to you is, would spouse two look after the green children as well as they would look after the mustard and the grey children? And what I would say is, it depends. Because there's some highly ethical families out there that this would never be an issue for. They might have bonded with those green children from an early stage, and they might be treated as their own children. Other families, the green children might end up in a punch-up with the mustard children. Spouse two now hates them. That's possible. Or the green children give spouse two some lip. And that relationship starts to erode. But it doesn't finish there, because spouse two then meets spouse three, who has the blue children, and together they have the pink children. And then spouse two is deceased. And my question to you now is, would spouse three care for the green children and the grey children, the mustard children? And if the green children beat up the blue children, would they still care for each other, etc.? So these are things you need to think about when you're setting up trusts. I had a client that came to me. Her issue was that she'd received a letter from her father, who was 73, terminally ill with cancer. The letter said, "Dear such and such, I've never loved you. We became estranged at an early age, you and your sisters. You sided with others against me and the family. I've now formed a relationship with my 24-year-old caregiver, who has 4 children, and I intend to pass the assets to that caregiver and her 4 children. I've amended the beneficiary class in the trust. You're no longer beneficiaries. In fact, I've excluded you as beneficiaries, and I've amended my estate." Why did that father send that letter? Pretty nasty letter. Why did he send it? He wanted the court to know that he was of sound mind, doing it for his own reasons. Now, let's look at the morals of this, because I have a real, and I have an issue with it, not because I don't think my view is he should have the right to do whatever he likes with his estate. He's of sound mind. If he wants to cut his kids out, that's fine. But whose estate was it in that trust? Was it his sole asset? No. In fact, it was 50% the asset of his deceased wife. And therefore, he's sitting in his trust that was his and his wife's trust. He's got half of her matrimonial property in there, and he's giving that to the 24-year-old with the kids, and cutting her half of the estate out of her natural bloodline children. I have a problem with that. So just be careful with trusts, because that can happen. Now, I would suggest that those beneficiaries could have sued. Could have sued because that trust was being varied from what it was set up for, and she went off to do that, and she was taking legal advice on that. And I haven't heard the outcome of that. But just be careful, because if the kids don't push, or if they're not aware, then these things can happen. So that, of course, is when 2 trusts become much more positive. Another example, a large asset base and a small asset base, spouse 1, spouse 2. Here, spouse 1 might not want to share their large asset base with spouse 2, and the parents with the large inheritance going through to spouse 2 might not want that to go to spouse 1. Now, if they put it all in one trust, separate matrimonial property rights get joined with joint matrimonial rights. Not good. And that's where you run 2 trusts. Joe's trust that has separate property, Trudy's trust that has separate property, and the joint stuff goes in the middle here, joint property held between the 2 trusts. And as a belts and braces approach, actually it's essential, you have a matrimonial property agreement, or relationship property agreement as they're now called, between Trudy and Joe, that says that they won't attack each other's trusts and that the assets going into those trusts are separate matrimonial property. And so it just tidies it up so that they divorce themselves effectively from each other's separate asset bases held in separate trusts.